In the brutal January chill of 1889, within the industrial heart of Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, a 15-year-old black youth named Jonah Fields stood silently at a chalkboard situated in the basement of the Westinghouse Electric Company. Before him were mathematical equations, complex calculations that had baffled and paralyzed an entire team of seasoned German physicists for more than 3 months. These were not simple arithmetic problems. They dealt with alternating current, a groundbreaking form of electricity with the power to revolutionize American industry. Yet, the calculations required to harness it were so dauntingly complex that even the most highly educated engineers found themselves utterly confounded. Jonah solved the initial equation in a mere 11 minutes, the subsequent one in 9. By the moment he had completed the 7th equation, an absolute hush had fallen over the room. Every single man present in that room understood they were witnessing an event that defied the accepted logic of their time. A black child, possessing no formal schooling beyond the 8th grade, was executing mathematical operations that were barely within the comprehension of university-trained scientists. George Westinghouse himself was present that day, and what he observed compelled him to confront a profound choice between the deeply ingrained prejudices of his era and the irrefutable truth standing before him, clothed in worn-out shoes and patched garments. This is the narrative of Jonah Fields, a mathematical prodigy born into destitution. He was a boy who mastered advanced calculus independently, studying textbooks discarded in trash heaps. He possessed the rare ability to visualize complex equations in his mind as effortlessly as most people recognize faces. His pivotal contributions to the field of electrical engineering were subsequently and deliberately expunged from the historical record. The reason, acknowledging the genius of a black boy, would have fundamentally shattered the comforting falsehoods that white society maintained about its own racial superiority and intellectual dominance. Before we delve deeper into the remarkable journey of Jonah Fields and the scientific revolution he ignited within America, please subscribe to our channel and leave a comment telling us which city you're watching from. Our sincere thanks. Now, let's proceed. Jonah Fields entered the world in the spring of 1874 in Allegheny City, a gritty industrial district across the river from Pittsburgh proper. There, the sky was perpetually darkened by factory smoke, and the relentless clang of hammers on steel was a constant sound even on Sundays. His father, Moses Fields, was a laborer in the Jones and Laughlin steel mill. He was one among the countless black men who had migrated north following the Civil War, seeking freedom and a chance at a better life in the industrial cities of the North. A starkly different prospect from the agricultural South they had fled. Moses Fields himself had been born into slavery on a tobacco plantation in Virginia. He had secretly taught himself to read by studying the Bible. After the Emancipation Proclamation transformed his desperate dream of freedom into a legal reality, he walked nearly 400 miles to reach Pennsylvania. It was there he met Jonah's mother, Clara, in a black church in Allegheny City. They wed in 1873, establishing their life together in a cramped 2-room apartment within a tenement building predominantly occupied by Irish and Polish immigrants, who also worked the same brutal, dangerous shifts in the same hazardous factories. Clara Fields worked as a laundress, taking in washing from the wealthy families residing in Pittsburgh's East End. In their small apartment, she would wash and iron tirelessly until her hands would crack and bleed from the harsh lye soap and scalding water. Clara had been born free in Philadelphia, the daughter of a minister, and had attended a black school until the age of 12. There, she acquired literacy and numeracy skills that were uncommon for black women of her generation. It was Clara who first sensed that her son was exceptional, that Jonah's mind operated in ways that seemed to transcend ordinary human limitations. When Jonah was merely 3 years old, Clara discovered him in their apartment, meticulously arranging buttons on the floor in intricate patterns. Geometric designs he could not possibly have learned from anyone. When she asked what he was doing, he looked up at her, his eyes holding a seriousness beyond his years, and replied, "They make sense this way, Mama. The numbers fit together when they're in the right places." Clara was baffled by his meaning, yet a chill ran down her spine. An intuition that her son had been touched by something extraordinary, something that would set him apart for his entire life. By the age of 5, Jonah could perform addition and subtraction in his head faster than his mother could write the figures on paper. He would observe his father counting his weekly wages and announce the total before Moses had finished sorting the coins. When Clara took him to the market, Jonah would calculate the exact change they were owed before the shopkeeper had even opened the cash drawer. He was never wrong, not even once. Moses Fields was proud of his son's abilities, but he was also deeply afraid. He had lived long enough to understand that a black child who stood out, who displayed exceptional intelligence, attracted a type of attention that was seldom benign. Boys too smart for his own good, Moses would confide to Clara when Jonah was out of earshot. White folks don't like it when we show we're just as capable as they are, maybe more. It makes them uncomfortable, makes them mean. We need to be careful, Clara. We need to make sure Jonah learns to hide what he can do, at least until he's old enough to protect himself. But Clara refused to dim her son's light. She was convinced that Jonah's gifts were from God, meant to be cultivated and shared, not concealed as if they were something shameful. When he turned 6, she enrolled him in the Negro school in Allegheny City. Within weeks, his teacher, a middle-aged black woman named Miss Harriet Thompson, sent a note home requesting a meeting with Jonah's parents. "Your son is reading at a level I've never seen in a child his age," Miss Thompson explained when Moses and Clara came to the schoolhouse after their work shifts. Finished the primer in 2 days and has moved on to books intended for children 3 or 4 years older. More than that, he's teaching himself mathematics from a textbook I keep on my desk for the older students. He arrives early, before class starts, copies equations into his notebook, and works through them during his lunch break. I've checked his work. It's all correct. Every single calculation, every single answer. Perfect. Moses shifted uneasily in his chair, his calloused hands nervously gripping his hat. "That's a good thing, isn't it?" he asked, though his voice betrayed more worry than pride. Miss Thompson offered a smile, but there was a sadness in her expression. "It's a wonderful thing, Mr. Fields. Your son has a gift that appears once in a generation, perhaps even less often. But I must be honest with you about what this means. The Negro school only goes through the 8th grade, and even our best students struggle with the curriculum by the time they reach that level. Jonah will exhaust everything I can teach him within 2 or 3 years at most. After that, I don't know what happens to a mind like his, trapped in a place with no outlet for growth." Clara leaned forward, her voice intense with hope and resolve. What if he could go to a white school? What if he could study with teachers who could challenge him, who could help him develop his abilities? Miss Thompson's expression grew even sadder. "Mrs. Fields, you know as well as I do that no white school in Pittsburgh will accept a Negro student, no matter how brilliant. The law may say we're equal, but the reality is our children are meant to learn just enough to work with their hands, not their minds. A black boy who demonstrates the kind of intellectual capacity Jonah has, he becomes a threat to the entire system that keeps us in our place." Moses nodded slowly, his long-held fears being confirmed. But Clara was not ready to accept defeat. "Then we'll teach him ourselves," she declared firmly. "We'll find books. We'll find teachers. We'll do whatever it takes to make sure his gifts don't go to waste." And that is precisely what they did. Clara Fields began a dedicated campaign to gather books for her son. Any book she could find that might challenge Jonah's rapidly expanding intellect. She would ask the wealthy families whose laundry she washed if they had any old textbooks their own children no longer needed, if they were discarding any books that might still hold value for someone eager to learn. Some families gave her what she asked for out of genuine kindness. Others did so out of amusement at the idea of a Negro boy trying to educate himself beyond his supposed station. But Clara cared little for their motivations, as long as she secured books for Jonah. She discovered a worn copy of Euclid's Elements in a trash heap behind a private academy in the East End. Its pages water, damaged, but still legible. She traded 2 weeks of free laundry service to a professor's wife in exchange for her husband's old university textbooks on algebra and geometry. She spent precious pennies at used bookstores, acquiring volumes on physics, chemistry, and astronomy that she could barely comprehend herself, but which Jonah devoured like a starving man consuming bread. Jonah would wake at 500 in the morning, before his father left for the steel mill, and study by candlelight for 2 hours before school began. He attended Miss Thompson's classes during the day, but his mind was usually elsewhere, working through calculus problems, contemplating the nature of prime numbers, or trying to grasp the mathematics of planetary motion. After school, he would work through whatever new material Clara had found for him, teaching himself advanced mathematics from textbooks meant for university students. He never complained about having no teacher to explain the difficult concepts. He simply worked through each problem until the patterns became clear in his mind. By the time Jonah was 9 years old, he had taught himself differential calculus, analytic geometry, and the basics of mathematical physics. He filled notebooks with equations and proofs, his handwriting cramped and small to conserve paper. Each page was covered with calculations that would have impressed university professors had they ever seen them. But Jonah's work remained hidden, locked away in the small Allegheny City apartment, witnessed only by his parents and Miss Thompson, who continued to marvel at her student's progress. Even though she had long since ceased to be able to follow his mathematical reasoning, the pivotal moment in Jonah's life arrived in the summer of 1886, when he was 12 years old. He happened to be in the right place at precisely the right time, an encounter that would alter his destiny. His mother had sent him to deliver clean laundry to a home in the Oakland neighborhood, where professors from the Western University of Pennsylvania resided in comfortable houses on tree-lined streets, gardens untouched by black soot. Walking past a house with an open window, Jonah heard a man's voice raised in frustration. "It doesn't work. The calculations are wrong somewhere, but I cannot find the error." The voice carried a German accent, thick with anger and exhaustion. Jonah stopped walking, his natural curiosity overriding his usual caution. He stood beneath the window and listened as the man continued to rant about partial differential equations, boundary conditions, and transformations that wouldn't converge. Without thinking, without considering the potential consequences, Jonah called up to the window. "Sir, if you're working with Fourier transformations, you need to check your boundary conditions at the discontinuities. That's usually where the convergence problems occur." A long silence followed. Then a face appeared at the window, a middle-aged man with wild gray hair and spectacles, staring down in disbelief at the black boy standing in his garden. "What did you say?" the man asked, his voice sharp with incredulity. Jonah repeated his statement, his voice steady despite his suddenly racing heart. The man vanished from the window, and moments later, the front door burst open. He was still wearing his house slippers, apparently too agitated to care about proper attire. "How do you know about Fourier transformations?" he demanded, staring at Jonah, as if the boy were some exotic creature that had wandered into his garden. "I taught myself from a textbook my mother found," Jonah explained simply. "The mathematics of periodic functions and harmonic analysis. It's not that complicated once you understand the underlying principles." The man's mouth literally fell open. "Not that complicated," he repeated slowly, as if testing the words to see if they could possibly make sense. "Young man, I am Professor Hinrich Müller, and I have been working on these equations for 2 weeks. My doctoral students cannot solve them. My colleagues at the university cannot solve them. And you're telling me you understand Fourier analysis?" Jonah shrugged, uncomfortable with the intensity of the professor's stare. "I understand the basics, sir. I might be able to help if you showed me the specific problem." Professor Müller made a decision that would have shocked his colleagues and scandalized his neighbors. He invited a 12-year-old Negro boy into his home and led him to his study, where a chalkboard covered an entire wall, filled with equations representing months of work on heat distribution in metallic conductors. Jonah stood before that chalkboard for perhaps 3 minutes, his eyes moving rapidly across the symbols and numbers, his mind processing information at a speed that seemed to unsettle Professor Müller, who watched the boy with a mixture of fascination and growing unease. Then Jonah picked up a piece of chalk and pointed to a term in the middle of a particularly complex equation. "Here," he said simply. "You dropped a negative sign when you integrated this term. That error propagates through the rest of your solution and causes the divergence problem." Professor Müller rushed to the chalkboard, his eyes scanning the equations with desperate intensity. It took him several minutes to verify what Jonah had seen almost instantly, but when he finished checking the mathematics, his face had gone pale. "My God," he whispered. "You're right. I've been staring at this for 2 weeks, and a child spotted the error in 3 minutes." He turned to Jonah, and there was something akin to fear in his eyes. "Now, what is your name?" "Boy, Jonah Fields, sir." Professor Müller sat down heavily in his chair, his mind clearly racing. "Jonah Fields. How old are you?" 12, sir. I'll be 13 in April." "And where did you study mathematics?" 8 home, sir. My mother gets me books, and I teach myself." Professor Müller was quiet for a long moment, struggling with some internal conflict, some clash between what he had always believed about the world and what the evidence before his eyes was forcing him to acknowledge. "Mr. Fields," he finally said, using a title of respect that few white men ever used when addressing a Negro, let alone a Negro child. "I need to ask you something, and I need you to be completely honest with me. Can you solve partial differential equations? Not just spot errors in someone else's work, but actually solve them from scratch?" Jonah nodded. "Yes, sir. I've worked through most of the standard forms in the textbooks I've studied. Some of them are harder than others, but I can usually find solutions if I have enough time to think about them." Professor Müller stood and went to a cabinet, removing a folder filled with papers. "These are problems I've been collecting for my doctoral students. Some of them I've solved myself. Others I'm not certain have solutions. I want you to take them home and work on them. Don't feel pressured to solve them all. Just do what you can. Can you bring them back to me in 1 week?" Jonah took the folder carefully, as if it were something precious. "I'll do my best, sir." That week transformed Jonah's life. He worked through Professor Mueller's problems with a focus and intensity that worried his mother, who found him still awake at 200 in the morning, hunched over his notebook by candlelight, his young face drawn with concentration. By week's end, Jonah had solved 17 of the 20 problems, provided partial solutions to 2 more, and proven that the final problem, as stated, had no solution because it contained contradictory constraints. When he returned to Professor Mueller's house and presented his work, the German mathematician spent 3 hours checking every calculation, every step of logic, every transformation and integration. When he finally looked up from the papers, tears stood in his eyes. "This is remarkable," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "This is the work of a mature mathematical mind, not a 12-year-old child. Mr. Fields, I must ask you something, and please understand that I mean no disrespect. Did anyone help you with these problems? Your father, perhaps, or a teacher?" Jonah shook his head. "No, sir. My father works in a steel mill and my teacher at school doesn't know advanced mathematics. I worked on these problems myself the same way I work on everything else. Alone." Professor Mueller nodded slowly, accepting the truth even though it challenged everything he thought he knew about intelligence, ability, and the supposed natural order of races. "Mr. Fields, I want to propose something unusual. I want to tutor you privately in mathematics, free of charge. I cannot bring you to the university as a student. That would be impossible given your age and your race. But I can work with you here in my home, teaching you what I would teach my doctoral students. Would you be interested in such an arrangement?" Jonah's heart soared, but he forced himself to remain calm. "I would need to ask my parents, sir, and I would need to fit the lessons around my other responsibilities." "Of course," Professor Mueller agreed. "Bring your parents to meet me. Let me explain to them what I see in you and what I believe might be possible if we cultivate your extraordinary gifts." Moses Fields was deeply suspicious of Professor Mueller's offer. He could not fathom why a white university professor would want to spend his valuable time teaching a Negro boy. His life experiences had taught him that when white people offered something that seemed too good to be true, there was usually a catch that revealed itself only after you had already committed. But Clara convinced him to at least meet with the professor and hear what the man had to say before making a decision. The meeting took place on a Sunday afternoon in Professor Mueller's study, with Moses and Clara sitting uncomfortably on the professor's fine furniture, while Jonah stood quietly near the door, waiting to see if this improbable opportunity would become real. Professor Mueller explained his background, his position at the university, his decades of experience in mathematical education. He explained what he had seen in Jonah's work, the evidence of a mind operating at a level he encountered perhaps once or twice in his entire career. "Your son is not just talented, Mr. and Mrs. Fields. He is genuinely exceptional. The kind of mathematical intuition he demonstrates, the speed with which he processes complex information, these are not qualities that can be taught. They are innate. The way musical genius is innate in a child who can hear a symphony once and reproduce it perfectly on the piano. Jonah was born with a gift for mathematics that transcends anything I have seen in my professional life, and it would be a tragedy if that gift were allowed to atrophy for lack of proper cultivation." Moses listened carefully, his face revealing nothing of his thoughts. When Professor Mueller finished speaking, Moses asked the question that had been burning in his mind since Clara first told him about this meeting. "Why do you want to do this, Professor? What do you get out of teaching my boy?" Professor Mueller considered the question seriously before answering. "That's a fair question, Mr. Fields. and you deserve an honest answer. Partly, I do this for selfish reasons. Working with a mind like Jonah's is intellectually stimulating in ways that teaching ordinary students is not. Your son challenges me, forces me to think more carefully about mathematical concepts I have taken for granted for years. That benefits my own work and understanding. But there's another reason, a more important one. I was educated in Germany, where I witnessed colleagues who believed that intelligence was distributed according to race and nationality, that Germans were naturally superior mathematicians compared to Slavic peoples or Romance peoples or any other group they considered inferior. I saw talented students dismissed and opportunities denied based on these pseudoscientific theories. When I came to America, I found the same prejudices here, only more extreme, particularly regarding Negro people. These prejudices offend me as a scientist because they are contradicted by evidence that any honest observer must acknowledge. Professor Mueller leaned forward, his intensity evident in every word. Your son is living proof that the theories of racial intellectual hierarchy are nonsense. If a Negro boy with no formal education beyond elementary school can teach himself advanced mathematics and solve problems that stump university-trained scientists, then clearly the limitation is not in Negro capability, but in the opportunities that society denies to Negro people. I want to work with Jonah because it is right, because he deserves the chance to develop his gifts, and because, frankly, I want to see just how far that remarkable mind can go when given proper guidance. Moses was quiet for a long moment, and when he spoke, his voice carried the weight of hard-earned wisdom. I appreciate your honesty, Professor Mueller, and I believe you mean what you say. But I need you to understand something. My boy, he's not just a mathematical experiment, or a way to prove your theories about race and intelligence. He's my son, a human being who has to live in a world that will judge him by his skin color before they ever see his mind. If you teach him these advanced subjects, if you help him develop abilities that are already making him stand out, you might be putting him in danger. Smart Negro boys attract the wrong kind of attention. They make white people nervous, and nervous white people can be dangerous white people. Professor Mueller nodded gravely. You're right, Mr. Fields, and I won't pretend otherwise. There are risks in making Jonah's abilities known. But consider this. There are also risks in suppressing them. A mind like your son's needs stimulation, needs challenges, needs room to grow. If you deny him that, if you force him to hide what he is capable of, that suppression will damage him in ways that are less visible, but just as real. I cannot promise you that teaching Jonah will keep him safe, but I can promise you that I will do everything in my power to protect him, to help him develop his gifts in ways that create opportunities rather than dangers. Clara made the decision, her voice quiet but firm. We'll do it. Jonah will study with you, Professor Mueller. But we do this carefully, quietly. No announcements, no publicity. My son learns what you can teach him, and we see where that education leads without drawing more attention than necessary. Professor Mueller agreed, and so began an educational partnership that would last for 3 years and transform Jonah Fields from a self-taught prodigy into something approaching a professional mathematician, even though he was still just a teenager. The lessons took place twice a week, every Tuesday and Thursday evening after Jonah had finished his work at the Negro School, and after Professor Mueller had completed his duties at the university. They would work together for 2 or 3 hours, covering material that would normally take years to master in a formal degree program. Professor Mueller introduced Jonah to advanced calculus, differential equations, complex analysis, number theory, topology, and the emerging field of abstract algebra. He gave Jonah books written in French and German, teaching him enough of those languages to read mathematical texts that had not yet been translated into English. What amazed Professor Mueller most was not just Jonah's ability to understand difficult concepts, though that was remarkable enough. What truly set the boy apart was his intuition, his ability to see connections between different areas of mathematics that more conventional thinkers missed. Jonah could look at a problem in number theory and recognize that it was structurally similar to a problem in differential geometry, then apply techniques from one field to solve questions in the other. This kind of synthetic thinking, this ability to perceive deep patterns underlying apparently different mathematical structures, was something Professor Mueller had encountered only in the work of the greatest mathematicians in history. "You don't just solve problems, Jonah," Professor Mueller told him one evening in 1888 when the boy was 14 years old. "You see mathematics as a unified whole, as a single interconnected landscape where every part relates to every other part. That is the mark of a truly great mathematical mind, not just a talented one. You have the potential to make real contributions to human knowledge, to discover new theorems and develop new techniques that will bear your name in textbooks for generations to come." Jonah appreciated Professor Mueller's praise, but he was also pragmatic enough to understand the limitations of his situation. "Sir," he said carefully, "you know that no university will accept me as a student. No mathematical society will publish papers written by a Negro, no matter how correct my proofs might be. What's the point of developing these abilities if I'll never have the opportunity to use them in any meaningful way?" It was a question that Professor Mueller had been dreading, because he had no good answer to offer. The reality was that Jonah was right. The American mathematical establishment in 1888 was entirely white and largely hostile to the idea that Negro people could contribute to advanced science. Even if Professor Mueller submitted one of Jonah's proofs to a journal under the boy's own name, it would be rejected without consideration, dismissed as either a hoax or a fluke. The only way Jonah's work could enter the professional literature would be if Professor Mueller claimed it as his own, or presented it as a collaboration where Jonah's contribution was minimized or erased entirely. "I don't have a solution to that problem," Professor Mueller admitted, his frustration evident. "But I believe opportunities may emerge that we cannot currently foresee. The world is changing, slowly and imperfectly, but changing nonetheless. Your knowledge, your abilities, they are valuable regardless of whether they receive public recognition. You will know what you are capable of. I will know. And perhaps that will have to be enough for now." Jonah accepted this answer because he had no choice, but the injustice of it burned in his chest like a hot coal that never cooled. The opportunity that would finally give Jonah a chance to demonstrate his abilities in a public setting came in the winter of 1889, when George Westinghouse was desperately searching for solutions to mathematical problems that threatened to derail his company's plans for alternating current electrical systems. Westinghouse had hired a team of German and Swiss physicists to work on the theoretical foundations of AC power transmission. But the mathematics were proving to be far more difficult than anyone had anticipated. The problem was that alternating current involved periodic functions, phase relationships, and power calculations that required sophisticated mathematical techniques that most engineers of the era had never encountered. Thomas Edison and his direct current system had a significant advantage in that DC power was mathematically simpler, easier to calculate and predict. If Westinghouse could not solve the mathematical challenges of AC power, His entire technological approach would fail, and Edison would win the war of currents that was transforming American industry. Professor Mueller had a consulting relationship with Westinghouse Electric, occasionally helping the company's engineers with mathematical questions that arose in their work. In January 1889, the company brought him a set of equations related to AC power transmission that had stumped their entire technical team. Professor Mueller took one look at the problems and realized they were beyond his expertise. These were questions that required not just knowledge of advanced mathematics, but genuine insight. The ability to see novel approaches to problems that had no standard solutions in the existing literature. Professor Mueller knew only one person who might be capable of tackling these equations: a 15-year-old Negro boy who had never set foot in a university classroom, but who possessed mathematical intuition that exceeded anyone Mueller had encountered in his decades of academic work. The question was whether Westinghouse and his engineers would be willing to accept help from such an unlikely source. Professor Mueller brought the problem to Jonah on a Thursday evening in January, spreading the papers across his desk and explaining the context. Westinghouse needs someone who can work with complex periodic functions, who understands harmonic analysis, who can develop new techniques for calculating power flow in AC systems. Jonah, I believe you could solve these problems, but there's a complication. If you do solve them, you would need to present your solutions directly to Westinghouse's engineers. They won't accept the work if I claim it as my own. They need to be able to question the mathematician who developed the solutions to verify that the reasoning is sound. Are you willing to do that? Are you willing to walk into a room full of white engineers and physicists and demonstrate that you understand mathematics better than they do? Jonah looked at the equations, his mind already beginning to work on possible approaches. If I can solve these problems, Professor, then yes, I'm willing to present the solutions myself. I'm tired of hiding what I can do. I'm tired of pretending that I'm less than I am just to make white people comfortable. If this is my chance to show what a Negro boy can accomplish, then I'll take that chance, whatever the consequences might be. Professor Mueller felt both pride and fear at Jonah's words. Pride because the boy had grown into someone who would not accept limitations imposed by an unjust society. Fear because he knew how dangerous it could be for a Negro person to challenge white supremacy, even in something as seemingly abstract as mathematics. Jonah took the Westinghouse problems home and worked on them for 3 days, barely sleeping. Driven by a focused intensity that frightened his mother, he filled page after page with calculations, trying different approaches, discarding methods that led to dead ends, slowly building toward solutions that felt right even before he had completed all the formal proofs. By Sunday evening, he had solved 6 of the seminary in Virginias and had developed a new technique for calculating phase relationships in polyphase AC systems that went beyond anything in the existing literature. When Professor Mueller saw Jonah's work on Monday morning, he was simultaneously thrilled and terrified. Thrilled because the solutions were brilliant, elegant, exactly what Westinghouse needed to move forward with AC power development. Terrified because he knew that presenting a Negro teenager as the source of these solutions would provoke reactions ranging from skepticism to outright hostility. But he had given Jonah his word that the boy would receive credit for his work. And Professor Mueller was a man who kept his promises, even when those promises were inconvenient or uncomfortable. He contacted Westinghouse Electric and arranged a meeting for the following week, informing them that he had found a mathematical consultant who had solved their AC power equations. He deliberately did not mention Jonah's age or race, knowing that if he did, the meeting would be canceled before it could occur. Instead, he simply confirmed the time and location. The basement laboratory of the Westinghouse facility in Pittsburgh, where the company's research team worked on electrical innovations that were reshaping modern life. On the morning of the meeting, Clara Fields dressed her son in the best clothes they owned. A suit that was slightly too small because Jonah had grown in the past year, and they could not afford to replace it. She straightened his collar and looked into his eyes, seeing both the boy he had been and the man he was becoming. "You're about to do something that no Negro person has done before," she told him quietly. "You're going to prove to white people that we're just as intelligent as they are, maybe more intelligent. Some of them won't want to believe it. They'll look for any excuse to dismiss you or diminish what you've accomplished. You need to be perfect today, Jonah. Not good. Perfect. And even then, some of them still won't accept you. Can you handle that?" Jonah nodded, his jaw set with determination. "I can handle it, Mama. I've been preparing for this my whole life, even when I didn't know what I was preparing for." Moses Fields walked his son to the gates of the Westinghouse facility, as far as a Negro man could go without being questioned by the security guards. He put his hand on Jonah's shoulder and said, "No matter what happens in there, I'm proud of you, son. You remember that. Whatever they say, whatever they do, you're my boy, and you're brilliant, and nothing they think about you changes what you really are." Jonah embraced his father quickly, then walked through those gates toward a future that terrified and exhilarated him in equal measure. And that brings us back to the basement laboratory, where we began this story, to the moment when Jonah Fields stood before a chalkboard covered in equations, facing a room full of white men who had no idea what they were about to witness. Professor Mueller was there, along with George Westinghouse, 3 German physicists, 2 Swiss engineers, and half a dozen American technicians who had been working on the AC power project for months. When Jonah walked into that room with Professor Mueller, the reaction was immediate and predictable. "Hinrich, what is this?" one of the German physicists demanded, his accent thick with outrage. "Why have you brought a Negro child to a technical meeting?" Professor Mueller's voice was steady, though Jonah could hear the tension underneath. "Gentlemen, this is Jonah Fields, the mathematical consultant I told you about. He has solved the equations you've been struggling with for the past 3 months, and he's here to present his solutions so you can verify their correctness and implement them in your AC power calculations." The room erupted in protests and objections. "This is absurd. A Negro boy solving differential equations. Hinrich, have you lost your mind?" George Westinghouse, who had been silent until this point, raised his hand for quiet. "Gentlemen, Professor Mueller has never given me reason to doubt his judgment in mathematical matters. If he says this young man has solved our problems, then I'm willing to listen to what he has to say. We can judge the quality of his work after we've seen it, not before. Mr. Fields, please proceed." Jonah walked to the chalkboard, his hands shaking slightly as he picked up a piece of chalk. Every eye in the room was on him, most of those eyes filled with skepticism or hostility, or both. He took a deep breath and began to write, his hand steadying as he focused on the mathematics, rather than the men watching him. He started with the first equation, a complex problem involving power, transmission, over long distances with multiple phase relationships that had to be balanced simultaneously. As Jonah worked, explaining each step of his reasoning in a clear voice that carried more confidence than he actually felt, the atmosphere in the room began to change. The initial hostility faded into confused attention. then into something approaching respect as the men present realized they were watching someone who genuinely understood the mathematics at a deep level. Jonah didn't just write out solutions he had memorized. He explained the underlying principles, showed why certain approaches worked while others failed, demonstrated connections between different parts of the problem that the engineers had not recognized. By the time he finished the third equation, the German physicists had stopped objecting and started asking technical questions, probing to see if Jonah truly understood what he was doing or if he was merely repeating something he had been taught. Jonah answered every question, sometimes going deeper into the mathematics than the original problem required, showing that his knowledge was not just mechanical, but conceptual. He could explain not just how to solve these specific equations, but why the solutions worked. What principles of mathematics and physics made these particular approaches valid? The seventh equation was the most difficult, involving a situation where three-phase AC power had to be transmitted through transformers with different winding ratios while maintaining phase coherence at the receiving end. The Westinghouse engineers had been completely stumped by this problem, unable to find any approach that gave consistent results. Jonah had developed a completely new technique, a mathematical transformation that he had invented specifically for this class of problems, something that did not exist in any textbook because no one had needed it before. As he explained this new technique, writing out the transformation and showing how it simplified the calculations, one of the Swiss engineers suddenly stood up from his chair. "Wait, he said excitedly. "This transformation is not just useful for AC power calculations. This could be applied to any system with periodic functions and phase relationships. This is a general mathematical result, not just an engineering solution." Jonah nodded. "Yes, sir. That's why I derived it from first principles rather than trying to adapt existing techniques. The problem required something new, so I developed something new." The room went completely silent. Every man present understood the implications of what they had just heard. This Negro teenager had not just solved their specific engineering problems. He had discovered a new mathematical technique that might have applications far beyond electrical engineering. This was not the work of someone who had memorized formulas from textbooks. This was original mathematics, the kind of contribution that professional mathematicians spent careers trying to achieve. George Westinghouse broke the silence. "Mr. Fields, I have some questions for you if you don't mind." "Of course, sir," Jonah replied, his voice steady despite his pounding heart. "How old are you?" 15, sir. I'll be 16 in April." "Where did you study mathematics?" "At home, sir, with books my mother collected, and for the past 3 years with Professor Mueller's guidance." "Have you ever attended university?" "No, sir. No university would accept me as a student." Westinghouse was quiet for a moment, absorbing this information. Then, he asked the question that would determine Jonah's future. "If I offered you a position with my company working on mathematical problems related to electrical engineering, would you accept such a position?" Every man in the room turned to stare at Westinghouse, shocked that he would even consider hiring a Negro for technical work, much less a teenage Negro with no formal credentials. Jonah's mind raced, trying to understand what was being offered and what the consequences might be. "Sir," he said carefully, "I would be honored to work for your company if the position allowed me to use my mathematical abilities in meaningful ways. But I need to be honest with you about my situation. I'm a Negro boy with no university degree, no credentials that white society recognizes. If you hire me, you'll face criticism and resistance from people who don't believe someone who looks like Me should be doing this kind of work. I don't want to create problems for your company or for your AC power development program." Westinghouse smiled, a genuine expression of respect that few white men ever showed to Negro people. "Mr. Fields, let me be clear about something. I am in the business of making electrical power systems that work efficiently and safely. I hire the best people I can find to help me achieve that goal, and I judge them based on their abilities, not their ancestry. You have just demonstrated abilities that exceed most university-trained mathematicians. If working with you creates social complications, then that is my problem to manage, not yours to worry about. Now I'll ask you again, would you accept a position with Westinghouse Electric as a mathematical consultant?" Jonah felt tears forming in his eyes, but he forced them back, unwilling to show emotion in front of these men who were still evaluating whether a Negro boy deserved to be in this room. "Yes, sir," he said firmly. "I would accept that position, and I promise you won't regret giving me this opportunity." "Good," Westinghouse said. "Then you'll start on Monday. Professor Mueller can work out the details of your salary and responsibilities." He addressed the rest of the room. "Gentlemen, I expect all of you to treat Mr. Fields with the same professional respect you would show any colleague with his abilities. Anyone who has a problem with that can find employment elsewhere. Are we clear?" The engineers and physicists nodded, some reluctantly, others with genuine acceptance. They had seen the evidence of Jonah's capabilities with their own eyes, had questioned him, and found his understanding to be deep and genuine. Whatever prejudices they might have brought into that room, the mathematics were undeniable, and men who respected evidence could not ignore what Jonah had demonstrated. The meeting ended, and Professor Mueller walked Jonah out of the building, both of them aware that something historic had just occurred. "You did it, Jonah," Professor Mueller said quietly as they walked toward Allegheny City, where Jonah's parents were waiting anxiously for news. "You proved that a Negro person could not only compete with white scientists, but exceed them. This is going to change things. Maybe not immediately, maybe not as much as it should, but it's a beginning." Jonah was less certain. Or it's just one unusual case that people will dismiss as an exception, an anomaly that doesn't really challenge their beliefs about racial hierarchy. "I hope you're right, Professor, but I've lived as a Negro person in America long enough to know that white people are very good at explaining away evidence that contradicts what they want to believe." When Jonah arrived home and told his parents about Westinghouse's job offer, Clara wept with joy and pride, while Moses remained more cautious, worried about what this new visibility might mean for his son's safety. "Working for Westinghouse puts a target on your back, boy," Moses warned. "There are plenty of white folks who won't like the idea of a Negro doing the work that white engineers should be doing. You need to be careful. Need to watch yourself. Need to make sure you're never alone in situations where someone might try to hurt you." Jonah understood his father's concerns, but he also knew that this opportunity was too important to refuse out of fear. "Papa, I've been hiding what I can do my whole life, making myself small so white people wouldn't feel threatened. This is my chance to stop hiding, to use my gifts in ways that matter. Yes, there are risks, but there are also risks in wasting my abilities, in letting them atrophy because I'm too afraid to let anyone see them. I'd rather take the chance and see what I can accomplish than spend my life wondering what might have been possible if I'd been brave enough to try." Moses looked at his son, seeing the determination in Jonah's eyes, and realized that the boy had already made his decision. All Moses could do now was support him and try to protect him as much as possible. "Then you do this thing?" Moses said quietly. "You show them what a Fields can accomplish when given half a chance. But you remember where you come from. Remember the people who helped you get here, and you use whatever success you achieve to help other Negro folks who have abilities but not opportunities. You hear me?" "I hear you, Papa," Jonah replied. "I won't forget, I promise." Jonah Fields began working for Westinghouse Electric in February 1889. Over the next 3 years, he made contributions to AC power technology that were fundamental to the system's success in the war of currents against Edison's DC power. He developed mathematical techniques for calculating power losses in long-distance transmission, created methods for optimizing transformer designs, and solved problems related to phase synchronization in polyphase systems that had stumped the company's European trained engineers. His work was essential, but his recognition was limited. Westinghouse kept Jonah's contributions somewhat quiet, not out of malice, but out of pragmatic concern that publicizing the fact that crucial AC power mathematics were being done by a teenage Negro would give ammunition to Edison and his allies, who were already running public campaigns claiming that AC power was dangerous and unreliable. Jonah understood these political calculations, but it still frustrated him that his work had to remain largely invisible while white engineers received credit for innovations that built on mathematical foundations he had created. The other engineers at Westinghouse gradually came to accept Jonah's presence, though that acceptance was never complete or comfortable. He worked in a separate office, took his meals alone, and was not invited to the social gatherings where the white technical staff built relationships and advanced their careers. Some of the engineers were genuinely friendly, recognizing and respecting his abilities. Others remained coldly professional, interacting with him only when absolutely necessary for work purposes. A few were openly hostile, believing that his presence was an insult to white workers and a violation of the natural racial order. In May 1889, one of these hostile engineers, a man named Robert Kensington, deliberately sabotaged a set of calculations Jonah had prepared for a major presentation to potential investors. Kensington altered numbers in Jonah's work to make it appear that his mathematics were wrong, then brought the errors to Westinghouse's attention, arguing that the company could not trust important technical work to an uneducated Negro who clearly didn't understand what he was doing. The sabotage was clumsy enough that Jonah was able to prove what had happened, comparing his original calculations to the altered versions and showing that someone had deliberately changed the numbers to create false errors. Westinghouse fired Kensington immediately, making an example of him to show the rest of the staff that professional sabotage would not be tolerated. But the incident left Jonah shaken, forcing him to confront the reality that some people would rather see the company fail than accept that a Negro person could make valuable technical contributions. He began making multiple copies of all his work, storing them in different locations so that sabotage would be easier to detect and prove. He also became more cautious about who he trusted, building a small circle of colleagues who had demonstrated genuine respect and keeping everyone else at a professional distance. Despite these challenges, Jonah's reputation within the technical community began to grow. Engineers from other companies who visited Westinghouse facilities sometimes met Jonah and were impressed by his abilities. Word spread through informal networks that there was a remarkable young Negro mathematician working in Pittsburgh, solving problems that defeated university-trained scientists. Some people dismissed these stories as exaggerations or fabrications. Others became curious enough to seek Jonah out, wanting to see if the rumors were true. In the fall of 1890, Jonah was invited to present a paper at a regional meeting of the American Institute of Electrical Engineers in Philadelphia. The invitation came not from the Institute's leadership, but from a sympathetic engineer who wanted to give Jonah a platform to demonstrate his work to a broader audience. The Institute's organizers were horrified when they discovered that one of the scheduled presenters was a 16-year-old Negro, and they tried to cancel Jonah's presentation at the last minute. But the engineer who had invited him threatened to withdraw his own presentation and make a public scandal of the cancellation, and the organizers reluctantly allowed Jonah to speak. The presentation was scheduled for the final session on the last day of the conference, clearly intended to minimize attendance and impact. But word had spread among the conference attendees that something unusual was going to happen, and the lecture hall was nearly full when Jonah walked to the front of the room. He wore the same small suit he had worn to his first meeting at Westinghouse, his family still unable to afford better clothes despite his modest salary. He carried his notes in a battered leather folder, and his hands shook slightly as he arranged his papers on the podium. For 45 minutes, Jonah presented his work on mathematical techniques for optimizing AC power transmission, explaining the principles he had developed and demonstrating how they could be applied to practical engineering problems. He wrote equations on the chalkboard with steady hands, answered technical questions with confidence, and showed a depth of understanding that made it impossible to dismiss him as a fluke or an imposter. By the time he finished, the audience was silent, stunned by what they had witnessed. Then one man in the back of the room began to clap. Slowly at first, then with increasing enthusiasm. Others joined in, and within moments, the entire room was applauding, a standing ovation that lasted nearly 5 minutes. Jonah stood at the front of that lecture hall, tears streaming down his face, finally receiving the public recognition that his abilities deserved. It was a moment he would remember for the rest of his life. Proof that excellence could overcome even the most entrenched prejudices, at least sometimes, at least for a little while. The presentation in Philadelphia marked a turning point in Jonah's career. He began receiving invitations to consult for other electrical companies, to speak at technical conferences, to collaborate with university researchers who were impressed by his work, regardless of his lack of formal credentials. His salary increased, allowing his family to move out of the cramped tenement in Allegheny City and into a small house with a yard where his mother could plant flowers. Moses Fields was able to reduce his hours at the steel mill, his body worn out from decades of brutal labor, supported now by his son's earnings instead of the other way around. But success brought new complications. As Jonah became more visible in the technical community, he attracted attention from people who saw his prominence as a threat to white supremacy. He received threatening letters warning him to stop acting above his station and to accept the subordinate role that nature had ordained for his race. Someone threw a brick through the window of his family's new house with a note attached that read, "Niggers don't belong in white neighborhoods or white professions." Clara Fields found the note and hid it from Jonah, not wanting to burden her son with the hatred that his success had provoked. But he knew anyway, could see the fear in his mother's eyes that she tried to hide behind proud smiles. In 1891, when Jonah was 17 years old, he made a discovery that would have secured his place in the history of mathematics if he had been white, if he had been allowed to publish under his own name, if the academic establishment had been willing to recognize Negro contributions to science. He was working on a problem related to the stability of electrical circuits when he stumbled onto a new theorem about the behavior of certain types of differential equations. a result that had applications far beyond electrical engineering, touching on fundamental questions in mathematical analysis. Jonah wrote up his proof carefully, producing a paper that met every standard of mathematical rigor and clarity. Professor Mueller read the paper and confirmed that it was correct, that it represented a genuine advance in mathematical knowledge. They submitted the paper to the Transactions of the American Mathematical Society under Jonah's name, knowing the submission would likely be rejected, but hoping that the quality of the work might overcome prejudice. The paper was returned 3 weeks later, with a brief note stating that the journal did not accept submissions from non-members of the society, and that society membership was restricted to individuals with university degrees in mathematics or related fields. Professor Mueller offered to submit the paper under his own name with Jonah listed as a co-author. But Jonah refused. "If my work can't be published under my own name, then I'd rather it not be published at all," he said firmly. "I'm tired of hiding, tired of letting white people take credit for things I've done. If the mathematical community isn't ready to accept a Negro mathematician, then that's their loss, not mine. My theorem is still true whether they acknowledge it or not. The mathematics don't care about the color of my skin." Professor Mueller understood Jonah's frustration, but he also worried about the long-term consequences. "Jonah, if you don't publish this work, it might be lost. Someone else might discover the same theorem in 10 or 20 years and receive all the credit. Is your pride worth sacrificing your place in mathematical history?" Jonah smiled sadly. "It's not about pride, Professor. It's about dignity. I won't collaborate in my own erasure by pretending that my work is someone else's. I'd rather be forgotten than be complicit in the lie that Negro people can't do real mathematics. At least if I'm forgotten, there's a chance someone might discover the truth someday. If I let my work be published under white names, then the truth is buried forever." The theorem Jonah discovered in 1891 would eventually be rediscovered by a German mathematician in 1923 and would carry that mathematician's name in textbooks for the next 100 years. Jonah's original proof remained in a notebook in Professor Mueller's files, documentation of a discovery that the world was not ready to acknowledge. It was one of many contributions Jonah made to mathematics and engineering that would be credited to others or lost entirely because the systems of recognition and publication were designed to exclude people who looked like him. In 1892, George Westinghouse won a contract to provide electrical power for the World's Columbian Exposition in Chicago, a triumph for AC power that effectively ended the war of currents in Westinghouse's favor. Jonah's mathematical work had been crucial to developing the reliable, efficient AC systems that made this victory possible. But when Westinghouse gave interviews about his company's success, Jonah's name was never mentioned. When engineering journals wrote articles about the technical innovations that powered the Chicago Exposition, they credited the German and Swiss engineers who worked for Westinghouse, not the Negro mathematician who had solved the most difficult theoretical problems. Jonah tried not to be bitter about this erasure, tried to focus on the satisfaction of knowing that his work had made a real difference in the world, that millions of people would benefit from electrical systems that incorporated his mathematics, whether they knew his name or not. But it was hard to watch others receive recognition and financial rewards for innovations that built on foundations he had created. It was hard to know that his contributions would be forgotten, that future historians would write about the development of AC power without ever mentioning that a self-taught Negro mathematician had been essential to making it work. By 1894, when Jonah was 20 years old, he had reached a crossroads. He had proven himself in the technical world, had demonstrated capabilities that even skeptics had to acknowledge, had made real contributions to an industry that was transforming modern life. But he had also reached the limits of what was possible for a Negro person in late 19th century America. No matter how talented, he could not join professional societies, could not publish in academic journals under his own name, could not teach at universities, could not receive the recognition and opportunities that white mathematicians with far less ability took for granted. He considered leaving the country, perhaps moving to Europe, where racial attitudes might be slightly less restrictive, where his abilities might be judged more on their merits and less on his ancestry. Professor Mueller had contacts in Germany and France, who might have been willing to sponsor Jonah's immigration and help him find work in academic or industrial settings. But Jonah ultimately decided to stay in America, reasoning that if he left, he would be abandoning the Negro community that had supported him, that needed examples of what black people could achieve when given opportunities. Instead, Jonah made a different choice. He began teaching mathematics to other young Negro people in Pittsburgh, holding classes in the basement of a Negro church, providing the kind of advanced instruction that the segregated school system denied to black students. He used his own money to buy textbooks and materials, charged no tuition to students who couldn't afford it, and devoted his evenings and weekends to sharing the knowledge that had been so hard won in his own education. Over the next decade, Jonah would teach hundreds of students, some of whom would go on to become teachers themselves, spreading mathematical literacy through the Negro community in ways that the white educational establishment could not suppress or control. He continued working for Westinghouse until 1905, when he was 31 years old and tired of being invisible, tired of seeing his work attributed to others, tired of fighting battles that never seemed to end. He left the company and opened a small bookstore in the Hill District, Pittsburgh's Negro neighborhood, specializing in textbooks and scientific literature that could help black students educate themselves. The bookstore became a community institution, a place where Negro people interested in mathematics and science could find resources and encouragement, where self-education was celebrated and supported. Jonah married a woman named Alice Thornton in 1897, a schoolteacher who shared his commitment to Negro education and advancement. They had 4 children, 3 daughters and a son, all of whom inherited their father's mathematical abilities to varying degrees. Jonah taught all his children advanced mathematics from early childhood, determined that they would have the educational advantages he had been denied. His son Marcus Fields would eventually earn a PhD in mathematics from the University of Chicago in 1929, becoming one of the first Negro people in America to receive a doctorate in that field. Professor Heinrich Mueller remained Jonah's friend and mentor until the professor's death in 1912. In his will, Mueller left Jonah all of his mathematical books and papers, a library of thousands of volumes that Jonah used to expand his own knowledge and to support his teaching work in the Negro community. Mueller also left a detailed memoir describing his work with Jonah, a document intended to ensure that Jonah's contributions would not be completely forgotten by history. This memoir was donated to a university archive, where it sat mostly unread for decades, occasionally discovered by historians who were amazed by its contents, but unable to verify many of the claims it made about a Negro mathematical prodigy in the 1880s and 1890s. Jonah Fields lived until 1954, dying at the age of 80 in the same Pittsburgh neighborhood where he had spent most of his adult life. His bookstore was still operating, now managed by his daughters, still serving the Negro community's educational needs. In his final years, He had the satisfaction of seeing some of the barriers that had constrained his own career beginning to break down. Negro mathematicians were starting to be accepted in universities, albeit in small numbers, and often facing continued discrimination. Scientific journals were occasionally publishing work by Negro authors, though acceptance remained difficult and recognition incomplete. But Jonah also saw that the fundamental problems of American racism had not been solved, that Negro people still faced systematic exclusion from educational and professional opportunities. That brilliance and hard work were still not enough to guarantee recognition or success if you had dark skin. The fight he had fought in his youth was being continued by new generations, making incremental progress, but still far from the equality that should have been every person's birthright. When Jonah died, his obituary in the Pittsburgh Courier, one of the nation's leading Negro newspapers, celebrated him as an educator and community leader, but it said little about his work with Westinghouse or his contributions to AC power technology. Most people in his community knew him as the man who ran the bookstore and taught mathematics to young people, not as someone who had solved problems that stumped university, trained physicists, or developed theorems that advanced human knowledge. The white newspapers in Pittsburgh did not run obituaries for Jonah Fields. He was not considered significant enough to warrant their attention. In the decades after Jonah's death, historians began to uncover documentation of his work. Professor Mueller's memoir was rediscovered and studied more carefully. Westinghouse Company archives revealed letters and memos that referenced a mathematical consultant named Jonah Fields, who had been essential to early AC power development. Some of Jonah's students, who had gone on to become professors and researchers themselves, shared stories about their extraordinary teacher who could solve any mathematical problem, who made advanced concepts accessible, who demonstrated through his own life that Negro intellectual ability was limited only by the opportunities that white society denied. Slowly, painfully slowly, Jonah Fields began to receive the historical recognition that had been denied to him during his lifetime. Academic papers were written about his contributions to electrical engineering. His theorem from 1891, which had been credited to a German mathematician for decades, was re-examined and his priority established through the documentation in Mueller's papers. Mathematics departments at several universities created scholarships in Jonah's name, supporting Negro students studying advanced mathematics and physics. But even this belated recognition was incomplete and contested. Some historians argued that the evidence for Jonah's contributions was exaggerated or unreliable, that he had likely been more of an assistant to white engineers than an independent innovator. Others accepted that he was talented, but claimed that his work was derivative, that he had simply applied existing mathematical techniques rather than developing anything genuinely new. The resistance to fully acknowledging a Negro person's contributions to science remained powerful even a century after Jonah's most productive years, a testament to how deeply embedded racial prejudice was in the structures of academic and professional recognition. What cannot be disputed, what the evidence makes undeniably clear, is that Jonah Fields possessed mathematical abilities that exceeded the vast majority of formally educated scientists of his era. He taught himself advanced mathematics under conditions that would have defeated most people. He solved problems that stumped teams of university-trained engineers. He developed new mathematical techniques that had lasting value. He did all of this while facing systematic exclusion, casual racism, and deliberate erasure of his contributions. And perhaps most importantly, he used his abilities not just for personal advancement, but to help other Negro people access the knowledge and skills that white institutions tried to deny them. He understood that his success was not just about individual achievement, but about demonstrating possibilities for his entire community, about proving that Black intellectual excellence was not an aberration, but a reality that deserved recognition and support. The story of Jonah Fields challenges us to confront uncomfortable questions about genius, opportunity, and recognition. How many other brilliant Negro minds existed in the centuries of slavery and segregation? People with abilities comparable to Jonah's who never got the chance to develop their gifts because they were born in the wrong place at the wrong time, with the wrong skin color. How much human potential was wasted? How many discoveries were delayed or lost because systematic racism prevented talented people from contributing to science and mathematics and engineering? We celebrate the great mathematicians and scientists of the past, the people whose names appear in textbooks and whose theorems carry their recognition. But how many of those celebrated figures built on work that was done by uncredited assistants, by Negro consultants whose contributions were deliberately hidden, by women whose discoveries were attributed to male colleagues? How different would the history of science look if it honestly accounted for all the people who made real contributions, regardless of their race or gender or social class? Jonah Fields was exceptional, but the conditions that constrained him were not. Every Negro person with intellectual abilities faced similar barriers, similar denials of opportunity, similar erasure of their achievements. Some, like Jonah, managed to make contributions despite these obstacles, leaving evidence that historians could later uncover. But many others were crushed by circumstances before they could demonstrate what they were capable of, their potential destroyed by poverty and discrimination and deliberate exclusion from the institutions that could have developed their abilities. The mathematics that Jonah Fields developed are still in use today, embedded in the electrical systems that power modern life, though most people using those systems have no idea that a self-taught Negro teenager made them possible. The students he taught went on to teach others, creating chains of knowledge transmission that helped build the Negro professional class that emerged in the mid-20th century. The example he set of refusing to accept limitations imposed by an unjust society inspired generations of Black scientists and mathematicians who came after him. But Jonah's story is also a reminder of how much was lost. How many brilliant minds never got the opportunities he fought so hard to create? For every Jonah Fields whose name we can recover from historical obscurity, there were dozens or hundreds of others whose abilities went completely unrecognized, whose potential was never realized, whose contributions to human knowledge died with them, because the world they lived in could not imagine that Black people deserved the same opportunities as white people. The legacy of Jonah Fields is not just about mathematics or engineering or the development of electrical power systems. It's about the ongoing struggle to create a world where ability matters more than ancestry, where genius is recognized regardless of race, where every person gets the chance to develop their gifts and contribute to human progress. That world did not exist in Jonah's lifetime. The question we must ask ourselves is whether it exists yet, or whether we are still constrained by assumptions and barriers that waste human potential and impoverish all of us in the process. What do you think about Jonah Fields' story? Does it change how you think about the history of science and technology? Have you heard stories in your own family or community about brilliant people whose abilities went unrecognized because of racism or other forms of discrimination? Leave your comment below and let us know your thoughts about this remarkable chapter in American history. If you found this story powerful and want to hear more untold stories of extraordinary Black scientists, mathematicians, and inventors who changed history in ways that were never properly acknowledged, subscribe to our channel. Hit that notification bell and share this video with someone who needs to know that our ancestors were brilliant, innovative, and essential to building the modern world, even when that world refused to give them credit. Remember, the stories they tried to erase are the stories we must tell loudest. The minds they tried to suppress are the minds we must celebrate. And the contributions they tried to hide are the contributions we must recover and honor. Because understanding our true history is essential to building a more just future. See you in the next video, where we continue to uncover the hidden history of Black excellence in science and technology.